to all of you guys. You've all played a very different role for me, but all a very important role in getting me this far. So given that, I'll go ahead and start with slide number 1. And it just basically, it tells the title of my dissertation. And it's the effect of reader's theater on fluency, comprehension, and reading attitude of students with varying reading abilities. So a little bit of introduction about the research and a little bit of background behind this. Bullet number 1, this really hits home with me because I'm a first grade teacher and I see this on a daily basis. Students come into my classroom at first grade, you know, they're coming in and they're tapping out the word cat every time they see it. They're tapping out the word cat. Every time they see it, they're tapping out the word dog. And so we're struggling. And at this point, they're expected to be, you know, disfluent at the beginning of the year. But oftentimes I see this toward the end of the year. And it's frustrating as me, you know, I've given it my all and they're still not where they need to be. So in this case, the research has showed that these students are disfluent. They're not reading where they should be reading. They're not reading with expression. They are not understanding what they're reading. And so this brings us to the last point on this bullet. So in order to kind of fix this problem, fluency needs to be implemented, and it needs to be implemented in an authentic way. And as we see on this next slide, usually, well, what I found before I get to that, what I found to implement it authentically is I found reader's theater. Like I said, it's more of a natural way to implement fluency. It embraces the repeated reading. In fact, that's really what it is. It's repeated reading. And then there's no question whether or not repeated reading is effective. That is all throughout the research. Yes, it is effective. And so we're taking an effective method that has been proven, and we're authentically incorporating it into our reading instruction. And once we have our students reading fluently, then they can comprehend what they read. And we all know that that is exactly what we want for our students. We want them to be able to read and then retell what they've read, answer questions about what they read. We want them to be able to give meaning to the text, to get something out of it. And my last point on this one is that if they are fluent, then they can comprehend. So they're more likely to have a good attitude about reading. They're more likely to try harder if they have a good attitude. And then on the reverse of that, their reading attitude, if it's negative, they're not likely to try very hard. They're not likely to want to read. So that is what I wanted to see. I wanted to see if reader's theater would help with comprehension, would help with fluency, and would help with reading attitude. So on my next slide, I'll just read to you basically my research questions are: what effect does participation in reader's theater have on reading fluency among students at varying reading levels? What effect does participation in reader's theater have on reading comprehension among students with varying reading levels? And then last, what's the impact that reader's theater has on the attitudes of students, their reading attitudes of students at varying reading levels? So moving on to the next slide. In order to do those 3 things, I thought it was important to first do some research and see what the research has said about those 3 things. So fluent reading, it's tied to reading comprehension. And then as you can see on the 3rd bullet there is definitely a relationship between those 2. And then on the last bullet, if you can fluently read, then that leads to comprehension. And then that shows your reading attitude is probably going to be better if you can understand what you've read and you can answer questions about what you've read and you're feeling successful about what you read. Now, going back up to the third bullet here, like I said, there is a definite relationship between fluency and comprehension, but theorists are kind of not in agreement on what that relationship is. Some of them say, well, in order for a student to be fluent, or in order for a student, the relationship between fluency and comprehension, some say that it is fluency comes first and then comprehension, while others say no, comprehension comes first and then they can read fluently. Well, just from being a first grade teacher for the past 13 or so years, I'm going with that students have to be fluent before they can comprehend. So that's kind of where I fall on that issue, and that is what I wanted to talk to you about before we go ahead and go on and do anything else. So the next part is the statement of the problem. First, I'll talk to you about what the research says, but then I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what's going on in my school and why this was a particular interest to me. So the research says that fluency is usually taught separately. It's not integrated. It's not seen as part of reading. It's just something else that we do on the side. And so then that takes us to the last bullet here, and it says that oftentimes fluency is taught as speed reading. So we pull little Johnny over and we say, little Johnny, here you go. You've got 1 minute. Go ahead, you read this. I'm going to time you, and you read this as fast as you can. So little Johnny reads, and then we tell him, okay, I've written down how many words that you've read in a minute. Good job. Now you practice this for the rest of the week, and then we'll do this again on Friday. And then we'll see if you did better. So Friday comes, and little Johnny reads it again, and little Johnny's a good student. So he's practiced through the week, and so we all imagine that, yes, he's going to do better. Well, yes, little Johnny, he did do better. But that's not what fluency is all about, and that's often how it's taught in our schools. It's just taught as speed reading, and that's definitely what we do not want to do. So that takes us to the next slide. So that kind of takes me into, why do I even care about this? Well, I'm a first grade teacher who teaches reading daily. It's a challenge, it's a struggle, but it's also rewarding. So my school, we knew we had to do something about reading in our school. Our scores, they just weren't where they needed to be. So at the time when we started, we said, okay, we'll start with these 1 minute time fluency passages, which, seemed like a good idea at the time. And it was more than we were doing. So each grade level, besides kindergarten, each grade level, started doing that. And as I was getting further and further into what I was studying on fluency, what we were doing at school, it just really didn't seem like enough. So I began digging more and more into the research, and that's actually where I found Reader's Theater. So it hopefully is going to be something that we can implement into our school, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we get down to the end. Okay, but the significance of this study, there's no question, like I said before, whether repeated reading or Reader's Theater, which uses repeated reading, there's no question whether or not that's effective. But most of the studies that have done this have done Reader's Theater with struggling readers, and they've had great success. Well, in my classroom, I do have struggling readers, but I have above average readers, and I also have average readers. So I wanted to see, well, we know this works for struggling readers, so is this going to work with a classroom of readers with different abilities? So that was the significance that I brought to this study. And now the next two slides, or yeah, 3 slides, they're about this theoretical framework, and it plays a very important part into my study. It kind of guided everything that I did, and I think it fits perfectly because it all goes back to the repeated readings, and that's basically what the theory of automaticity says. It says that if we are giving all of our attention to decoding, if every time we come to the word cat, we have to say at cat, and we have to do that for every word that we come to in a sentence, then there's nothing left. There's no cognitive processes left for us to comprehend because we've used them all up for decoding. We just have nothing left. We have no idea what we just read. And I see that daily with my students. I see that daily. So what the theory of automaticity says is that basically we need to move from non-automatic reading to automatic reading. And the way that we do that, and I think this is actually on the next slide, yes, the way that we do that is through repeated readings, but we don't want to do it in a way where we call little Johnny up and we time him. We don't want to make that the only thing that we do. So, but once we read or once we become automatic, then we have enough cognitive processes left or enough mental capacity left for us to say, I know what I read. I understand this because I didn't have to spend all of my time decoding every word. I know what I read. You know, I read with meaning. I read for meaning. You know, I can understand this. And again, that's the goal that we have for all of our students when they are in regards to reading. And then on this slide, it's another theoretical framework that plays an important role in what I did. It's Vygotsky's social learning theory. And you can tell by the name that social interaction, it was very important in a child's cognitive development, according to Vygotsky. And on our second point here is the more knowledgeable other, mostly in a classroom, that's the teacher. But as we all know, students can learn from other students. So that plays a role in there as well. But the third point is what I really want to emphasize on this slide. It's the zone of proximal development, which we've all probably heard of. But I know I'm guilty as a teacher of not always doing what this research suggests. So, but the zone of proximal development says that, well, it's kind of the gap. It's the difference between what a person can do or a child can do by themselves versus what they can do with support. So what that means to me as a teacher and all educators is that I need to be teaching my children right there in that zone. I don't want things that are too easy for them. I don't want things that are too hard for them. I don't want to help them too much, but then again, I don't want to leave them hanging out there with not enough support. So I want to give them the right amount of support and teach them where they are in their zone of proximal development. And so that also helped explain my research questions, and it helped guide my study. And I will use all of these studies here again at the end to kind of help explain some of the findings here at the end. Okay, now my literature review. I picked out some of the most profound things I thought from my literature review. The first one is a direct quote that says, "Reading is one of the most important early academic skills for students to acquire in school. Yet, learning to read continues to be a struggle for many elementary age students in our nation's schools." So, given that, let's look at number 2. The bullet number 2 says, only 35% of fourth grade students were proficient or above proficient in reading. So then that leaves us, if 35 were what we would say proficient or above, then that means 65%. 65% were not in fourth grade. They were not proficient in reading. And then I wish I could say that that's okay because things got better. But according to this statistic, I can't really say that because 4 years later, when they got in 8th grade, it went down from 35% to 33%. So that means now that 67% of 8th graders getting ready to go into high school aren't reading at grade level. So that really hit home with me, and not that I'm gonna change the world, but I can change what I can. And so I set off to do my little study, and here's my methodology. And my population came from a small rural elementary school in Southeast Tennessee. It has about 300 students in grades K through 5. I had a treatment group and a control group. So the school had 3 classes of first grades. So the treatment group was one of the first grade classrooms, and the control group was one of the first grade classrooms. And the treatment group, they received Reader's Theater for 4 weeks, and the control group, they just went on with their regular reading instruction, which was their basal reader. And because our school had previously implemented pulling little Johnny over here to read for a minute, doing that all week with him and seeing if he improved. So then the control group was also doing that, whereas the treatment group, like I said, was doing Reader's Theater. So we had 13 students in the treatment and in the control group. And the control group was matched by reading levels. And the reading levels came from the STAR. So the control group and the treatment group they were matched academically by the reading levels. And the type of study, we have a quasi-experimental study, which means that it wasn't random sampling. And you can see the second point here is that random sampling, is feasible, is a reasonable alternative to random sampling when you're in an educational setting. And like I said, it was a match group design because we matched the academic abilities of the treatment group with the control group. Okay, now we're getting down here to the data analysis. Now, what I have on this slide, these are the tests that I was able to do, or this is the analysis that I was able to do with parametric test. And the test that I did was the independent t-test, and I was able to do the independent t-test on the comprehension scores, which came from our STAR reading test. So I gave the STAR reading test to the treatment group and the control group for a pre-assessment, and then I did that again for the post-assessment. And then I took the difference of the means for the treatment group and the control group for on those measures. And I analyzed it with the independent t-test. It was independent because students were not both in the treatment group and the control group. There were different students that were in the control group, and then different students were in the treatment group. So this, again, is the measures that I was able to do with the parametric test. And an assumption of parametric test is that the population distribution or the equality of variances is similar, and that was met with these populations. So again, I was able to do the independent t-test for the comprehension scores, and as well as for the Ames-Webb 1-minute timed reading test, which again is only a small portion of fluency, and I will get to the rest of that here. I think it is on this next slide. Yes. So going on with our data analysis, this is the part that I did with a non-parametric test called the Mann-Whitney-Hughes test. It's similar to the independent t-test, but it's a non-parametric test because my data was ordinal. because it was a ranking scale on both of these things. And I'll explain to you the multidimensional fluency scale. It had on it expression and volume, it had phrasing, and it had smoothness. So those were the other factors that go along with the reading rate when we're talking about fluency. And then the elementary reading attitude survey, the students were asked questions simply like, do you like to read? And they would rate themselves. It had Garfield faces, and they would rate themselves going from reading makes me, feel happy, I'm a little bit mad, I'm really mad, or I don't really like this at all. So there were various questions that students had to answer, and they would rate themselves. Okay. So a little bit more about the Mann-Whitney U test. It can compare the means or the median. So I had to go back and I had to decide, well, what's appropriate here? Am I going to compare the means, or am I going to use the medians? So you can see here on bullet number 2, it says that I need to compare the medians if the population samples are similar. Well, according to my histograms, my population means were not similar. So I used the means instead of the medians here for the Mann-Whitney test. Okay, now we're getting down to the results. And you can probably hear in my voice that I'm not very happy with the results. I was really hoping for some more significant differences than what I found, but here is what I found. Fluency, it was analyzed separately. So first, rate was analyzed by the independent t-test, and then expression and volume was analyzed by itself, and then phrasing was analyzed by itself, and then smoothness. And all of those were not significant when they were analyzed by themselves. And you can see here on the first or the second bullet here, the p-value is 0.06, and all of these had the alpha of 0.05. So I guess you could say that was my closest one. As my dad always says, close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades, I think is what he says. But that's kind of my closest one was expression and volume. And I'll talk a little bit more about why I think that happened in just a second. And then phrasing, here again, you can see the p-value was 0.257 with an alpha of 0.05. And then in smoothness, it was again analyzed by the Mann-Whitney Hugh with an alpha of 0.05 and the p-value of 0.403. And then the last one, the last part of the reading rate, which was the one that was analyzed by the t-test because of the type of data that it was, with an alpha of 0.05 and the p-value of 0.352. So not significant there either. But there is a little, there's a little bullet right here. I did my own little non kind of sophisticated math here, I guess, which included division and subtraction. And I found this chart that that told me, and I plan to use it. I'm really glad I found it. I plan to use it a lot. It told me how many words per minute a student should be gaining per week. So doing my division, here's what I found on this. Although not statistically significant according to the t-test, maybe this lends some support for Reader's Theater, because it says that there was an increase of words per minute in a week for the treatment group of 3.42. So that was their overall increase of words per minute in a week. But for the control group, there was just an overall increase of 2.73. So that gives a little bit, maybe, in favor of Reader's Theater. So, but once I combined all these prosthetic elements, the prosody components, the expression and volume, the phrasing, and the smoothness. Everything but reading rate, when those were combined, I did get a significant difference. And that right here is on the bottom with the alpha of 0.05 and a p-value of 0.034. And in just a few slides down, I'll kind of explain why I think that happened. Okay, let me make sure I didn't skip. Okay. So we've talked about fluency. Now, my second research question was reader's theater effective in increasing comprehension? And again, I accepted the null hypothesis. I mean, it is what it is, and I think maybe if I could have done this a little bit longer, along with some other things I'll tell you in just a second, I think maybe I would have got something different. So my alpha was 0.05 and my p-value was 0.911. And then reading attitude here again, analyzed by the Mann Whitney U, I did not get a significant difference in the treatment and the control group. So that takes me to my explanations. Okay, here, based on what I've learned in all of this and the research, I've explained to you this part already, but let me add in there too that reader's theater does not emphasize reading rate. That just comes along as a good side effect, I guess you could say. That just comes along with it. But think now about the control group. They're doing their regular basal reading, and then they're doing their 1-minute time test on the side here. So they are emphasizing reading rate, but reader's theater did not, and reader's theater still had a 3.42 overall increase without emphasizing reading rate, and the control group had 2.73 when they were emphasizing reading rate. So my second bulletin here says that this gives support to the idea that reader's theater is beneficial for all readers when you want to increase their reading rate, and you don't even really have to focus on reading rate. That just kind of happened. Okay, so I think, yes, I've kind of explained everything on that slide. So I'll go on to the next one. So here I'm talking about the prosody components of fluency, which again are expression and volume, phrasing, and smoothness. So expression and volume, that just means, is the child changing their voice? Are they reading really, really soft? Are they reading with excitement? You know, are they taking on the character and talking like that character would be talking? Phrasing here means, am I reading word by word, or am I able to chunk 2 or 3 words together? And then smoothness means, am I choppy? Am I having to stop and sound things out? So that's kind of what those prosody elements of fluency mean. So, like I said before, reader's theater, it doesn't focus on reading rate, but what it does focus on are these prosodic elements. And then when I did combine all these, I did get a significant difference. So down here at the bottom, educators should investigate reader's theater as a means to increase those prosodic elements in their reading. If they have students who are struggling with that part of fluency, reader's theater might be able to help those type of students. Okay, and then comprehension. So here is how I'm going to use the theory of automaticity and the zone of proximal development to help explain why I accepted the null hypothesis. The theory of automaticity, like I said back at the beginning, it talks about I cannot focus on decoding while I'm comprehending. I can't focus on both of those things. So now we have to think about the students who were in this study. They're not all on grade level. the students in this treatment group and in the control group both, they're not on grade level. There were some of them that are at kindergarten level, and they were thrown a script that was on first grade level, which was clearly out of their zone of proximal development. And even though they did repeated readings and they did it authentically, it just was not in their zone of proximal development. They were supported, but even that, with that support, the script just wasn't where it needed to be for that child to be successful. Okay, so the implications that I have down here is that educators, we need to be aware, and we need to teach our children in their zone of proximal development. We need to make sure that we're giving them their amount of scaffolding that they need to meet their individual needs. Okay, and reading attitude. Again, I accepted the null hypothesis, which said there was no difference between the treatment group and control group in regards to reading attitude. So to help explain this, there is research that says that students in the early elementary have a good reading attitude. I mean, think about it. They go from opening a book, they're looking at the pictures, and that's pretty much all they can do. And that's fine. That's how students, start beginning their reading skills. That's fine. But in first grade, especially at this point in first grade, they're able to open up that book.
Rebecca, I've got to interrupt. I just got a text message. My son and husband, there's been an accident at the ball field. I've got to go.
Okay.
I'll check back later.
Okay. Good luck.
Okay.
Okay. Gosh, I hope that turns out okay. All right. Can you all still hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, students, they can open up these books and they can read now, and that is so exciting for them. And so they have a good attitude, and that is supported. That's supported by research here, that, as you can see. But sadly, number 2, that reading attitude, it declines as students progress through school. So my implication here was that Reader's Theater could be used as an avenue to get those kids who have that poor reading attitude to just bolster that attitude. Because here, on my last slide here are the positive experiences that I got from my kids that were in the treatment group. When are we going to practice for Reader's Theater? And some of them would even say, when are we going to practice for that thing? And number 2 said, can we read it again? Can we do it again? They would ask. But my most favorite one is this last one, and it came from a struggling reader that I have. And she said, this is fun. I am a good reader. And as a teacher, that's what you want your kids to do. So these positive comments, they meant the world to me, and they really meant more to me than the numbers did. And like I say, if I could have been in a situation where I could have done this for longer, I think I would have had different results. But if I could do this again, I would probably focus a lot more on the students' comments and how maybe more the qualitative side instead of the quantitative side. And so that is my presentation on Reader's Theater.
All right then.